Well, hello,
Hello.
little flock. Not many of us here today. My sermon today is just some things I've thought about over the years, and a lot of other people has thought along these lines as well. And I don't know if I'll help you or confuse you, but it's about God and our concept of God. Like most people, as I was growing up, I grew up with an image of an all-wise, all-powerful God as an all-wise, all-powerful parent figure who would treat me as my earthly parents would, or maybe even better, especially if I were good and obedient and deserving of something. That he would reward me if I did what was right, and if I got out of line, he would discipline me, reluctantly, but fairly. That he would protect me from being hurt or hurting myself, and would see to it that I got what I deserved, or at least what I thought I deserved in life. Now, does that sound about right in our concept of God? First of all, how have we developed this concept? In my case, it was because I could read scriptures such as Isaiah 3:10 and 11, where where it says, "Tell the righteous it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their deeds. But woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for with what his hands have done shall be done to him." Is it because of what I read in Proverbs 12:21? It says, "No ills befall the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble." Or in Job, maybe 14:7, it says, "Consider what innocent ever perished, or when have the righteous ever been destroyed?" And you can also read similar statements in Psalms and Proverbs and statements by the prophets. We read such scriptures and we get this concept that nothing bad ever happens to the good and the righteous. And it's this type of scripture which also brings about another concept, of which we'll get to in a moment. I won't bring that up right now. But even as I grew up having this concept of God, I was aware of human tragedies. Maybe some young person got killed in a car accident or car crash, maybe killed by a drunk driver, or some person who may have been, had some crippling disease. I went to school with two different individuals who had been crippled from polio from birth or as a little child. And one of the best teachers I had in high school was a crippled lady. I had seen members of the neighbors die because of some terrible disease, such as cancer. I'd seen people get shot, through a quarrel or maybe a drug deal or some criminal in an attempted robbery. I'd seen mentally ill children among some of the neighbors. Of course, my whole family was accused of being mentally ill. "You people are crazy," people would say. Oh, well, maybe we were a little crazy. But seriously, this awareness never caused me to wonder about God's justice. I never questioned his fairness, for I knew, without a doubt, God knew more about his creation than I did. But, it was always somebody else. And then one day it happens to you. Tragedy comes into your life. You have a family member who has been diagnosed with some terrible disease. You anoint them. You pray for their healing, as God has instructed us to do in his written word, and they still die. Or maybe you have a family member who gets killed in a car crash or something. About 3 years ago, my sister died with colon and liver cancer. Just recently, one of my brothers fell dead from a massive heart attack. And it's things like this which make some people begin to question God and His promises. Why is this happening to me, God? I've done nothing to deserve this. I'm a good person. I strive to live your way of life. Why is this happening to me? Why do bad things happen to good people sometimes? Did you not say, God, that you would uphold the righteous? Well, God does say that He'll uphold the righteous and deliver just punishment to the wicked. But what most people fail to understand is that God is not bound by time as we are. 2 Peter 3:8 tells us, be not ignorant of this one thing. One day is with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. And, of course, Peter is quoting from what King David said here in Psalm 94. For 1,000 years in thy sight, speaking of God, are but as yesterday when it is past. And it is but like a watch in the night. That's where he was quoting that from. But we as humans have the temptation to try to compress the promises and actions and the justice of God into our short lifespan. And it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes yes, but most of the time no. And when we do this, we begin to doubt God and question God when everything doesn't come to pass and work out as we expect it to with the concept of God that we have. God is eternal, my friends, something of which you and I cannot comprehend at this time. He has all the time which will ever exist, and all the time which will ever... He has all the time which has ever existed, and all the time which will ever exist, to do what He says He will do. Now, that being said, as we read through the Bible, we realize God does have certain time frames in which He does or will do things, certain things. But that's not for us to question. That is His prerogative. That is His exclusive right, for He is the Almighty. So how do we make sense of it all? For we have all been hurt by life. We've all been hurt by illness and injury, by rejection and disappointment. And as we look around, we see hardly any true justice in this world whatsoever. And we feel like that we deserve better than what we have. When bad things happen to us, do we still turn to God for strength and hope? Or do we get angry with God and reject God? Do you want to believe in God's goodness and fairness, but find it hard to do so because of the things which have happened to you and the people you love? Well, hopefully we can do that by understanding a little more about God. Because trying to understand and make sense of the world's pain and evil only from a human perspective can only lead to further doubt. Therefore, why do the righteous suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? That's the question which is asked by thousands of people. We've all asked that question. Not only by those going through some of the terrible crises of life themselves, but by many who look around and see what they perceive to be all the unfair distribution of suffering in the world. Therefore, the misfortunes of good people are not only a problem to the people who suffer and their families, but are also a problem to everyone who wants to believe in a just and fair world. It raises the question about goodness, the kindness, and even the existence of God among some people? Well, first of all, we don't live in a fair world. And most people don't understand God's concept of time and justice. King Solomon, supposedly one of the wisest men who ever lived, in Ecclesiastes 13, I've got 13 through 15. I've missed the chapter or the verse or something here. But anyway, I'm going to read this from the New English version of the Bible. He says, "Consider God's handiwork. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When things go well, be glad. But when things go ill, consider this. God has set the one alongside the other in such a way that no one can find out what is to happen next." So there is good and there is evil in the world. He says, "In my empty existence, I've seen it all. From a righteous man perishing in his righteousness to a wicked man growing old in his wickedness." And you know, we look at things like that and say, that's not fair. God's not fair. But sometimes that's the way things is. So no, folks, this is not a fair world. We can sometimes see bad things happening to righteous people. And sometimes the wicked do flourish in their wickedness. And we scream at the top of our voices, that's not right. And no, it is not right. But again, we have the temptation to demand of God He make things right now, in our time frame, within our physical existence. And He does not always do that. And that is when a lot of good people began to question God. They questioned His goodness, His fairness, and does He really exist? If you read the Bible long enough, and I've been reading it for almost 40 years now, I have come to the conclusion that God does not like to be questioned about His motives and timelines. It is not for puny man to demand of God that He do certain things a certain way in a certain time frame. We do not have that right. Now, does that mean God does not answer our prayers? Of course not. Only that if He doesn't answer them the way we would like, we have no right to question Him as why He doesn't. Sometimes prayers are answered in ways we don't expect, and sometimes God just says no to our prayers. That's hard to accept sometimes, but He does. Sometimes He just leaves us hanging out there to dry in the wind, as the old saying goes. Should this diminish our faith in God? Absolutely not. We only need to come to the realization God will administer rewards to the righteous and damnation to the wicked in His own time frame, not ours. And this, folks, is what works patience and faith in our lives regarding our ultimate goal of salvation. However, there's a big problem. Most people don't have any patience and have no desire at working to acquire any. This makes it hard to teach anyone that God is in control and is responsible for the ultimate end of all things. Thus they wonder, why do totally unselfish people sometimes suffer? People who never did anything wrong. And again they ask, why do the righteous sometimes suffer? Why do they have to bear extraordinary burdens of grief and pain? Then comes the idea that God gives people what they deserve. There's people that, we tend to think like that. And that our misdeeds causes all our misfortunes. And God will give people exactly what they deserve. But we try to condense it into the here and now. not allowing for God's time schedule. And this gives people a neat and attractive solution to the problem of evil. However, this has some limitations. First of all, it teaches folks to blame themselves. And believe me, a lot of time we are to blame for our own misfortunes. But it can also create guilt a lot of time where there is no basis for guilt. It can make people hate themselves and even hate God. For sometimes the situation does fit the facts. I read a story about a little boy who was given an eye examination, and he was found to be a little nearsighted, and he required glasses. Now, this wasn't any great surprise. Both his parents wore glasses, and all his older siblings wore glasses. But it disturbed him greatly, and he wouldn't tell anybody why. And when it finally came out, it was found that himself and some of his friends was looking through the neighbor's trash that was to be picked up, and they found a copy of Playboy magazine. With the sense that he was doing something wrong, as they looked at the pictures of the unclothed women, when he took his eye test, he jumped to the conclusion that God had begun the process of punishing him with blindness for looking at those pictures. That's a little child, but that's the way a lot of adults look at various situations as well. And that's not the way it always is. And King David helps us to understand this better in one of his Psalms, Psalms 92. Psalms 92, beginning in verse 5. He says, and I'm going to read this from another version of Scripture as well. It says, "How great are your deeds, O Lord! Your thoughts are very deep. The ignorant and brutish man does not comprehend them, nor does the fool understand them. When the wicked spring up like grass, and the workers of iniquity flourish, it is that they might be destroyed forever." And then verse 12, he says, "But the righteous all flourish like the palm tree, and grow mighty like a cedar of Lebanon." In verse 15, "To declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no righteousness in him." So, to make sense of life's trial by saying people do in fact get what they deserve, we see it is not always immediate, but over the course of time. At any given moment, life can be unfair to innocent people, and innocent people may suffer. But we see that if we wait long enough, which is faith, if we wait long enough, we will see God's plan unfold and emerge, and we will see justice brought about. David explains the world's apparent evils and misfortunes, of which the good sometimes suffer, has to suffer and endure. This in no wise compromises God's justice and righteousness. He does this by comparing the wicked to grass, as we just read here, and the righteous to palm and cedar trees. If you plant grass seed and a palm tree seed on the same day, the grass will start to sprout much sooner than the palm seed. And this, at this point, a person who knows nothing about horticulture might predict that the grass would ultimately grow to be higher and stronger than the palm tree, since it was growing faster. However, the experienced observer would know that the head start of the grass was only temporary, and it would wither and die in a few months. While the palm tree, growing steadily, would grow tall and straight and last for a generation or more. And David also suggests foolish, impatient people, they see the prosperity of the wicked and the suffering of the upright, and they jump to the conclusion that it pays to be wicked. But you have to observe the situation over the long haul. Then you will see the wicked will wither like grass, and the righteous will prosper, slowly but surely, like the palm and the cedar tree. Being dishonest and unscrupulous often gives people a head start, like the grass, but justice will finally catch up with them. Maybe not in this lifetime, but it will finally catch up to them, for this life is not the end of things, because God says so. Evil people will get a just sentence for unrepented evil they have committed, just as the righteous will be rewarded for their righteousness. Maybe not in this life, but it will come. Still, even knowing this, it's still troubling to us and hard to contemplate why good people seemingly suffer for no apparent reasons. A lot of good people die with life unfulfilled. Others find length of days is more of a punishment than a privilege. So we sit and ponder why God allows the suffering of good people in this world. Some folks think suffering for God is a privilege. And when we suffer, it is always for some good reason. And I'll have to say, if I must suffer, I want it to be for God's cause. But I still don't think it's God's desire that we suffer. God takes no pleasure in seeing us hurt and in pain. Otherwise, He would... Why would He have told us to be anointed? That we could be anointed and be healed of our suffering. And, of course, we know there's a sickness unto death. God will not keep healing us forever in the flesh. Yet, sometimes we suffer, and God just doesn't give us the answer, does He? Like Brother Job. We just never get the answer. And we'll get over to the book of Job in a minute, because this sermon wouldn't be complete without it. But first, let us consider another question. Can suffering be educational? Can it cure us of our faults and make us better people? Some folks would like to believe that God has good reasons for allowing us to suffer. And they try to imagine what those reasons are. Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveshek, I guess is how you pronounce that, he was quoted as saying this: "Suffering comes to ennoble man, to purge his thoughts of pride and superficiality, to expand his horizons. In sum, the purpose of suffering is to repair that which is faulty in a man's personality." And there may be some truth to that. Just as a parent sometimes has to suffer a child whom he loves for the child's sake. A parent who pulls a child out of a busy roadway or refuses to give him a candy bar before supper is not being mean and punitive and unfair. He or she is just being a concerned, responsible parent. Sometimes a parent even has to punish a child with a spanking or deprivation. I know I got enough of them when I was growing up. Well, maybe not enough, but I got plenty of them. Let's put it that way. Sometimes a parent has to punish the child to drive home a point or lesson. Now, the child may feel he or she is being arbitrarily deprived of something and may wonder if his parents really love him. And if they really did, how could they treat him this way? But that is because they are still children. When they grow up, they will come to understand the wisdom and necessity of it. Similarly, we are told God treats us the same way a wise and caring parent treats a naive child. keeping us from hurting ourselves or withholding something we think we just have to have. Punishing us occasionally to make sure we understand we have done something seriously wrong. And patiently enduring our temper tantrums at His unfairness in the confidence that we will in one day mature and understand that it was for our own good. That may be one reason we sometimes go through trials. For Proverbs 3:12 tells us, "For whom the Lord loves, He chastises, even as a father does to the son he loves." But this only works when you know what you're being chastised for. If you don't know what you're being chastised for, if you don't know what you're supposed to repair in your life, it makes no sense. For this to work, there must be some clear connection between the fault and the punishment. A parent who disciplines a child for doing something wrong but never tells him what he's being punished for only leaves the child in a state of confusion. Yet there are people who suffer tremendous tragedies, it seems, for no apparent reasons. The response to tragedies by most people have one thing in common. They all assume that God is the cause of all our suffering. And they try to make sense and understand why God would want us to suffer. Is it for our own good, they ask? Or is it the punishment we deserve? Or could it be God doesn't care what happens to us at all? Some folks blame themselves for the tragedies in their lives. And sometimes that's where the blame should rest. But not always. They blame themselves in order to spare God's reputation. Others deny reality and repress their true feelings and are left either hating themselves for deserving such a fate or hating God for sending it to them when they did not deserve it. And that's the way we tend to think sometimes. However, is it possible there could be another approach? One of which I happen to favor. Could it be that God does not cause our suffering, except for the occasional chastisement to put us back on the right path? Maybe the suffering and tragedies in our lives happens for reasons other than the will of God. King David writes in the book of Psalms. This is in Psalms 122, 1 and 2. If you want to jot that down. He says, I will lift up my eyes unto the hills from which my help comes. I will lift up my eyes unto the hills from which my help comes. My help comes from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. He does not say my pain comes from the Lord, or my tragedy comes from the Lord. He says my help comes from the Lord. Could it be He doesn't decide when a family has a handicapped child? Could it be He doesn't decide when someone is shot and killed by a thug or drug dealer? Could it be He doesn't decide when someone is killed in a car accident? Or rather, could it be He stands ready to help us as we cope with our tragedies? If we could only get beyond the feelings of guilt and anger which separate us from Him. Also in Ecclesiastes 9, 11 and 12, King Solomon says this. He says, I returned and saw under the sun, and the race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither bread to the wise, or riches to men of understanding, or favor to men of skill, but time and chance happens to us, to them all. Time and chance happens to all of us, folks. For man does not know his time, as the fish which are taken in an evil net, and the birds that are caught in the snare. So are the sons of men snared in an evil time, when it falls suddenly upon them. So could it be? How could God do this to me really be the wrong question for us to ask? Now let's go to the book of Job. For the book of Job tells us a whole lot about ourselves. Now, I've heard some preachers get up and give entire sermons on the book of Job as to how Job was a dirty, rotten, self-righteous sinner, and that that's what the whole book was about, self-righteousness and nothing more. And God did all these things to Job to teach him just how self-righteous he was, and that he wasn't better than God. Well, Job did learn some lessons. But just to set the record straight, first of all, Job did not think he was better than God. That was not the lesson. And there's more lessons to be learned from the book of Job than that of self-righteousness. And furthermore, the self-righteousness of Job, folks, was no greater than our own. For I guarantee that most of us would have reacted probably worse than Job did under lesser circumstances. I'm quite sure of that. So the first question we need to ask is, why did all these tragedies fall upon Job to start with? Did God bring all these terrible tragedies upon Job? No, he did not. He allowed them to happen, but he himself did not bring any kind of tragedy upon Job. Chapter 1. Let's read here a moment. Chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, one that feared God and shunned evil. Then verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. Now verse 8. And the Lord said unto Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that fears God and shuns evil? So we see Job was a righteous man. He was perfect in what he understood. But like us, he didn't understand certain things. One in particular. Verse 9. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job, fear God for nothing? Have not you made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his substance has increased in the land. No wonder Job fears you and serves you, Satan says. You've put a protection about him, his house and all you've given him. You've made him rich. No wonder he serves you. But just take away all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. So the Lord granted Satan the power to destroy all that Job had. And he did. Satan destroyed all his substance and all his family except his wife. And what did Job do? Did Job curse God as Satan said he would? No, he did not. Verse 20. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped, and said, naked I came out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return tither. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God foolishly. Job did not attribute any of his folly to God's charge. And rightly so, because it was not God who did it. Now, we'll see later that he thought it was, but we can see God here showing Satan that he is wrong in his assumption of God's people. God's people do not follow him because of what he does or does not give them. God's people follows God because they believe in him. They believe in his laws and in his commandments and his promises concerning salvation. God's people follow him because they love him and his love towards them, not for material things. But why did the Lord choose to use Job to make this point to Satan? Because of what we just read in verse 8 there, that there was none like him in the earth. In other words, he was the only one who could stand the test, and God knew that. And besides, there were some things Job needed to learn through the whole ordeal as well that would make him even more righteous and have more respect for his Creator. So the Lord was essentially killing two birds with one stone, as the saying goes. However, Satan, in his determination to prove the Lord wrong, came before the Lord yet on another occasion. And again in chapter 2, verse 3, here we read, "The Lord said unto Satan, Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that fears God and shuns evil? And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you move me against him to destroy him without cause." Or to swallow him up, as the margin says. And we see here that by the Lord's own mouth that Job had done nothing to deserve what he was getting. And this is the view most people hold when tragedy strikes good people, them or someone else. Oh, you must have some terrible hidden sin to get what you're getting. You're getting exactly what you deserve. And that was Job's friends' view of the situation as well. This is the view most people hold when tragedy strikes good people. Verse 4, let's read on here, verse 4. "And Satan answered the Lord and said, Skin for skin. Yea, all that a man has will he give for his life. But put forth your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, he is in your hand, but save his life. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils, from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. And Job, that is, took a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. Then said his wife unto him, Do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die. Well, what's wrong with upholding your integrity, folks? When you know you've done nothing wrong to deserve what you're getting, or because of some tragedy which may have befallen you. There's nothing wrong with upholding your integrity. And Satan, he really knows how to work and who to work through, doesn't he? He knew if Job would listen to anyone, he would listen to his wife. Satan killed all the rest of Job's immediate family, but yet he preserved his wife's life because he thought through her he could get Job to curse God and prove he was right. I mean, Satan wanted to prove himself right and God wrong. But Job didn't listen to her either. Now, she probably did curse God. I don't know if she died or not, but I don't have much doubt she cursed God. Verse 10, but he said unto her, you speak as one of the foolish women, as the foolish women speak. What shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? And all this did not Job sin with his lips. And then we see Job's friends showing up on the scene. And they sat there 7 days before anyone said anything. Then Job speaks, and he begins to moan the day he was born. The old woe is me story. Then his friend Eliphaz, in chapter 4, if you could call him a friend, answered him. And that's 4 verse 7 through 9 again. We see that he begins to hint to Job that there must be some hidden sin in his life to bring him to this point. And a lot of times that's how people looks at things. He says, for consider what innocent man ever perished. Where have you seen the upright destroyed? This I know, that those who plow mischief and sow trouble reap as they have sown. They perish at the blast of God and are shriveled by the breath of his nostrils. Yep, Job, you've done something wrong. And you're getting just what you deserve. And that's the way people think today. But you and I know that that was not the case. God said that he had done nothing. Then in verse 12 through 17, I'm not going to read all this, I don't have time. Eliphaz claims to have had a vision in which he heard a voice say, shall mortal man be more just than God? Shall a man be more pure than his maker? Here he accuses Job of thinking he was better and more pure than God. And as you read through the book, and as I said, we certainly don't have time to do that, you will see this is not the case at all. Eliphaz was falsely accusing Job of something which was not true, as did the rest of his friends. They accused him of being a vain man. They accused him of having some great iniquity in his life, and that he should repent of it. Job accused them of being forgers of lies and physicians of no value, he called them. Miserable comforters, he says, he called them. They accused him of speaking vain words, and he accused them of the same thing. I know just as much as you do, Job said. So they spoke back and forth, each claiming to know more about God and how he operates than the others. One did. God does this because of we do this, and God does this because of that situation. They all thought they knew more about God than they really did. Just as we do sometimes. Just as the whole church of God did at one time. They accused Job of some great sin, and he kept maintaining his innocence. Now, where Job really slipped up, in my opinion, Arden Taylor's opinion, is he wanted to plead his cause, to argue his case with God as to his righteousness and his being treated unfairly. When in fact, it wasn't God who did it to him to begin with. It was Satan the devil. Yes, I know God allowed it to prove a point to Satan, but it wasn't God who actually did it. However, Job had no way of knowing that, so he thought it was God's doing. And a lot of times when things happen to us, we think it's God's doing, when in fact it's not. Job questioned God, just as we sometimes question God, and we don't have the right to question God. God does not belong to us. We belong to God. We are His property to do with at His discretion. Now, I know that's sometimes hard to swallow, but nevertheless, that's the way it is. Humanity wants to use God when they need Him and disregard Him when they don't. And my friends, it don't work that way. Well, as we go on here, Job started to feel sorry for himself. And he kept wanting to argue with God in an effort to justify his righteousness. And that's exactly the way we are most of the time. We all want to justify our actions rather than justifying God in His actions and what He's doing or allowing. And sometimes bad things happen. When bad things happen, we seemingly always want to argue and accuse God. Therefore, when we have met Job, we have met ourselves. When in fact there ought to be a sense of relief in coming to the conclusion that God is not doing this to us. He is not the cause of our calamities. In the end, Job did learn some valuable lessons. He learned that he didn't know as much about God as he thought he did. He learned not to speak about things of which he had no knowledge. He learned that you don't condemn God to maintain your own righteousness. He learned to put away his pride and to be humble. And that's the way we are, you know. Sometimes we think we know more about God than we do, how He acts in certain situations. And we condemn God sometimes. When something happens to us, the first thing we say, why, God? Why is this happening to me? Why are you doing this to me? When in fact, it's not God doing it at all. Our misfortunes are not of God's doing. And we can turn to Him for help. God is a God of justice and power, and His justice will prevail in His time schedule. In the meantime, He can still be on our side when bad things happen, for He knows His true people are good and honest people who deserve better. Again, our misfortunes are not of His doings. Our question should not be Job's question. God, why are you doing this to me? But rather, God, look what is happening to me. Will you please help me? We need to turn to God, not in accusations, but to be strengthened and comforted. We have to grow up as Job and his friends did and realize our concept of God as a little child might not be totally correct, and that we need to sometimes adjust this concept. Although God is an all-powerful, all-knowing God, there are some things He takes a hands-off approach to, and we need to accept that. And if we do, then we can turn to God for things He will do to help us, instead of holding on to unrealistic expectations of Him, which probably will never come about. The Bible repeatedly talks of God as a special protector of the poor, the widow, and the orphan, without raising the question, you know, of how they became poor, widowed, and orphaned in the first place. We can maintain our self-respect and sense of goodness without having to feel that God has judged us and condemned us. We can be angry at what is happening to us without being angry at God. For God is also angry at the injustice and unfairness which His people sometimes suffer. Rather than being opposed to God, we need to cry out to God for all the unfairness this world throws at us. And this world is an unfair world. God knows that it's an unfair world. And He knows that sometimes bad things happen to good people. And through it all, remember, God is still on our side, although our relief might not come in this life.